this session, session 4B, is going to be quite interactive, and it's about specifically how we use language and writing skills to get a message across really clearly to decision makers. And what I'm going to be drawing on in this session is my experience in science journalism. So for several years, I was a researcher and writer for a website called Carbon Brief, where I covered, wrote blogs or looked at the latest scientific articles that were coming out in the research community and tried to kind of summarize them for a lay audience. So it's not the same as writing for a decision maker, but there's certainly some skills that I would say are really transferable. So I'd like to take you through that today, basically. So just to frame this, what Lucy took you through earlier was a session to learn you how to teach you how to engage with the people that your research can help. And what I'm going to do now is look at the actual writing, but there is a step missing, and we should acknowledge that. So in between what Lucy said and what we do now, ideally you'd go out and do this middle section, which is you would go and approach your end user and have a structured interaction with them, have that conversation, get that information from them, draw out their wants and needs. And once you've done that, and once you've analysed that, then you can come to the writing. And what we hope the output of this whole process is that you end up with a well-informed policymaker who is armed with information that they can use. So that is my happy, smiley policymaker. So there's just one thing that I always keep in mind when I am writing, and maybe it's a bit critical and maybe it's a bit of a blunt tool, but it really sticks in my head. And it's that there's no point writing something if nobody reads it. There really is no point. And of course that doesn't apply if you're writing in a journal or something that's kind of self-reflective, but if you're writing for someone, then you want to make sure they can read it, and it's on you to use your writing skills and your language carefully and execute it well if you want someone to read it and stay engaged. So I want you to think about the amount of time that goes into planning and conducting your research. So perhaps for a PhD, that's sort of like 3 years or longer for some big international projects. We spend a lot of time planning and conducting the research. And then typically communicating the results of our research becomes a bit of an afterthought. If I was to ask you how much time and effort you spend on your communications and planning it and delivering it, it probably wouldn't be 10% of what's spent planning and conducting your research, although I'll be delighted to find out that it is. And this is where I want to encourage a bit of a switch. I want to encourage you to think about your communications right from the beginning. So right when you're starting out on your project, and certainly as you're conducting your research, I want you to be thinking about your end user and who you hope your work will influence ultimately. And certainly at the point you come to start writing, you need to really have the reader in the forefront of your mind all the time, because you're writing for them. You're not writing for yourself. You're not writing for your peers in academia. So put aside all the kind of norms you have about how you write, and just focus solely on making it something that they can and want to read. So perhaps you're new to even thinking about writing for policymakers, and there is a spectrum, which is what I wanted to tell you about next. You can do really direct engagement with policymakers, and if you have just gone through that process that Lucy talked about, where you are engaging with them and having a conversation, you're going to probably be ending up producing something like a briefing note, or co-authoring a report for them. And that's a really direct form of writing for policymakers. But there's other ways, excuse me, you can get started. Sorry. There's other ways you can get started. So maybe you would contribute to a briefing note or a post note. You might give evidence to a select committee. You might engage with policymakers through the media, or you might look to co-author a commentary piece. So that could be somewhere like The Conversation or Carbon Brief, or you might look to do commentary pieces in other kind of magazines that are read by policymakers. So things like The Economist feature really good content on climate change. So there is a spectrum. You don't have to leap straight in at the deep end and be writing briefing notes. Maybe if you're newer to this space, so I just talked to someone in a breakout room who is coming today to kind of get exposed and learn all the different ways that she might go about taking her career so that she can start to influence policymakers. So you might want to think about starting at the less direct end, but the process that Lucy outlined for you really helps with the most direct end of that spectrum. So I've got a little activity to send you off to do to start with. And this is basically a progression that we're going to go through over the course of the next sort of 40 minutes. So I want you to keep whatever you write and continue to write beneath it. So I'm going to ask you to write 3 sentences that sum up your research. And now I want you to focus on how your work could be useful to policymakers and what messages you'd want them to take away. So I literally want you to grab a pen and paper and write that down now, or open a Word document, whatever works for you. Now, I appreciate some people in the audience won't be actively researching. So if you can't talk about your own research, then feel free to summarize anything you listened to from days 1 and 2 of the summit, or perhaps any research that you're interested in, or write about a historical scientific discovery, anything that you can draw on some details about. So I would like you to do that now. I'm going to sit here very quietly until 15:19. Okay, so we've got just about 1.5 minutes left for you to be writing the summaries of your research. Okay, I'd like to bring us all back now then. So keep that safe, whatever you've written just there. We'll be coming back to it. So what I want to do now is I want to bring my colleague Chris in, because we have done a really good experiment, which I'd like to kind of explore with you all. And this is an experiment about what we think we've said versus what someone else hears. And so imagine that those summary sentences, you had to now explain them to someone. What you communicate to them may not be what the listener has understood. And so it's really interesting to think, if we were to tell someone about our research, would the right message come across? So Chris, are you able to kind of explain the activity that we sometimes do with clients to test this out?
Yes, so we run quite often science communication training for environmental scientists, sometimes for policymakers and other audiences as well. And one of the exercises that we often do is ask people to write a short paragraph about their work, either their research or their policy work. And then we just get them to share that in the group with one another. And there was one particular training that we did 2 years ago, where we actually had a cross-sectoral audience. We had people from universities, we had people from government departments, and we had people from conservation organizations, from NGOs. And just the fact that they were sort of different audiences to one another, that really made this exercise incredibly useful, because there were quite a few people, especially those on the policy side, who did a lot of stakeholder engagement, who sort of said, well, when I started this exercise, I thought I really had it. I thought I knew how to do this, but I wrote my sentences. And then when it came to me to share them, and when the feedback came, the feedback that I got from others, but also hearing everyone else give feedback to other people, made me understand that what I was saying was not necessarily landing with people in the way that I thought it was going to land. So that's ginger all over in the language of the session earlier today. So what we then, so we did that, we go around the room, everyone shares, then we give people another opportunity to update and to improve, and that usually makes a big difference. But what we often do afterwards is that we encourage people to keep on going on with that process, to enter a cycle in which you make some improvements, and then you go out and you get feedback on that. And some people that we worked with took that really quite in very nice direction. So there was one person, for instance, an environmental scientist, who said a couple of weeks after in an evaluation call, she said, well, I took my pitch, my 3 lines to my corner shop, and I was speaking to the woman. I asked the woman behind the counter, can I please try out my explanation of my work on you? And other people said that they were traveling on the train and they would ask people sitting next to them, can I please try out my explanation of my research to you? And by entering in a process of testing, of experimenting, and then improving, that really helps people to refine and then turn things in a language that makes it land with more people. That's really quite unusual in a scientific community or in an expert community. We try to produce the perfect paper or the perfect article, and then we send it off for review to our peers. And often when we do that, we find out that they actually didn't understand what we were trying to explain if the peer review isn't very helpful. So we then often blame them. We then say, oh, they didn't understand it. But if you do this a couple of times with different people, you often discover that it is something that you can improve in the way that you're communicating, rather than saying, oh, it was my audience that didn't understand what I was saying.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a parallel I can draw as well from my time doing science writing at Carbon Reef. So we didn't, well, there was a very quick bit of feedback as to whether your piece was understandable or not, because there is kind of an editorial check. So you'd write a piece that you thought had explained a complicated piece of science really, really succinctly and clearly, and you'd send it to the editor, and if the editor couldn't understand it or thought it was in any way unclear, they'd send it straight back to you. and you might get a bit of an earful for sending in something so far off the mark. So that was my way when I was kind of doing more journalism roles, that I would get that feedback, that filter, and I would know straight away that what I thought was coming across clearly and was being communicated well actually wasn't landing at all. But there was also a risk that my editor knew the subject area somewhat better than the average person on the street, and the risk there was that like some things might make it through, might make it past the editor and still not make sense to the general public. So my kind of second check, or sometimes my pre-check, if I'm honest, would be to make my sister read it. Sorry, I should say ask my sister to read it. And I would send her my work, and she's in a completely different field, my sister. So I'd say to her, please, will you read my article? Does it make sense to you? And if she had to call me up and go, Freya, I didn't get this bit, can you explain it to me? Well, then I knew that was in no fit state to send to the editor. So these checks sort of do happen in other ways, but you're right, Chris, that probably not so much in the scientific community, and that's something we could steal from elsewhere and really use to benefit our work, I think. So yeah, I think what the point is here is that there's often a gap between what we think we've said and what other people understand from it, and we need to do whatever we can to close that gap. And the main way we can do that is by testing on others, and getting that feedback. But once you've done that work, another thing you can do is to just use English language skills to their kind of full power to make sure that anything you write comes across really clearly and succinctly. And so that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to get on now to the writing hacks. So I'm going to take you through 5 hacks today. There's probably loads more, but these are the ones that stick with me and that I picked up as a writer, and that I now sort of enforce on my colleagues sometimes as well. So the first hack is to ask yourself, so what? So when you write about your research, basically ask yourself in a grumpy teenager voice, so what? Like, why should I care? Because that's sometimes our research is really interesting to us, but we haven't conveyed why an audience would be interested in it or why they should care about it. So we want to really ask ourselves, why is this important? And how does this impact people? And why would a decision maker care about this? Not just because it's interesting, but how does it impact on them and their role and the people or the organizations that they look after? So you might find you need to actually ask this question several times. Sometimes the first iteration doesn't get you down to right down to the core of what the point of your research is for the reader. And so don't be afraid to ask it once and ask it again and ask it again. And so with that in mind, I'm going to ask you to do that now. So revisit your notepad or your piece of paper, wherever you wrote your few sentences summarizing your research. And I want you to apply the so what technique to it. I think I've called it so what your science. So you've got 4 minutes, and in that time I want you to either rewrite one or several of your sentences to address the so what question. And I'm just going to give you an example on the right so that you can know how to apply it. So say, for example, my research was on sea level rise, and it might have concluded that sea levels are predicted to rise 0.5 meters globally by 2050. So what? Why would a policymaker care about that? Well, they might care about it if I start speaking in their risk currencies, and the things they care about are perhaps widespread flooding, crop destruction, and human displacement. So it's really taking what your science says and then going on to say why that matters to the person you're trying to influence. So I'd like you to do that now. I'm going to give you 4 minutes, so we'll be back at 15:32. So you've just got 60 seconds to go now. Okay, last few seconds. And once again, just keep that bit of paper safe. We're going to revisit our sentences again and apply some more hacks later. Okay, I'm going to restart us now. So my second hack that I want to talk you through is about thinking about your sentence length and your sentence structure. So you've probably had time to read this, which is what I hoped. A sentence is more likely to be clear if it's short. It's just easier to read. So those are two very short sentences. And really what you want out of a short sentence is for it to just communicate one idea. So for example, scientists predict heat waves may double by 2060. The short sentence kind of has everything contained within it. It can be read on its own, and you don't have to get to the end of a long sentence to find out, you know, details that relate to the start of the sentence. So particularly when you're writing for a non-specialist audience, always try and keep the ideas to just one per sentence. That makes it really easy for them to engage. So as we move on to sentence structure, I want to just kind of go through what are the commonly used sentence structures and help you identify which of them are the types of structures that you already use. So these sentences can go from less complex to more complex. The simple sentences are the ones we've just sort of had an example of, and then they go all the way up to complex and compound sentences. But of course, you need to know how to spot them in your writing if you wanted to consciously choose to go for a simpler version, which is what I would advocate for. So my hack really is use the simplest type of structure that you can that fits for the work that you're doing. So here's just some examples of what each of these structures looks like, what they contain, so that you can then go away and look if they apply to your writing. So the simple sentence just has one subject and one statement. So in this example, the green plants are the subject, and the fact that they produce oxygen from carbon dioxide is the statement. A compound sentence joins together two or more of these simple sentences using a conjunction. So in this example, I've taken the first sentence, this simple sentence on the left, and I've added, and they remove pollutants from the air. So that's a second simple sentence that I've joined together. Now those are quite lovely, those simple ones. But what we see more of in scientific writing typically are the complex and the complex compound sentences. So a complex sentence is something that has one main statement and then it has a qualifying statement. So I've tweaked the first example we had there, and this time it reads, green plants through a process called photosynthesis produce oxygen from carbon dioxide. And it's that text highlighted in pink there that is the qualifying statement. It tells you how it happens. And so you can kind of imagine the complex compound is when you have multiple complex sentences joined together. And I see these a lot in kind of scientific literature, and certainly did when I was reading a lot of it as a journalist and trying to translate it into kind of layperson speak. So these are the ones where you have several complex sentences and they're all joined together. And they can be really wordy. So the example I've got here is kind of green plants through a process called photosynthesis produce oxygen from carbon dioxide and remove pollutants, especially particulate matter, from the air. I mean, I wanted a breath in that sentence saying it, so I can't imagine a reader staying too engaged if they have to sit through lots of those sentences. So I want to just put up side by side the benefit and show you the benefit of using the simpler structure. So on the left is that example I just read you through. On the right is here, this is how you could rewrite it using simpler sentence structures. And it doesn't lose anything, it doesn't lose any meaning. All it does is give you the ideas in more succinct packages, simpler sentences. So we could say green plants produce oxygen from carbon dioxide. They do this through a process called photosynthesis. They also remove pollutants, especially particulate matter, from the air. And that's kind of more in line with how I would talk if I was to say this out loud. So that can be a good little trick for you as well. If you write something and then you need to take breath to read it out loud, you know, you could probably have made it a bit simpler. So I just want to show you the contrast really of choosing what kind of sentence structure you use in your writing, because neither are wrong, but one is much easier to stay engaged with and to follow, particularly if you're a non-specialist. So here we go. We're going to attempt the Slidos again. I want you to try and join this poll, and I'd like you to look back at your summaries that you've written, and I'd like you to let me know whether you can spot any complex compound sentences in your summaries. So if the poll is working for you, thank you, Joes. Just put the number in the chat as well. Have a look at your sentences. I'll give you a minute or so to do that. And let's see who's spotted them. Gosh, the pros are really getting in there early. Exciting. So 13 of you have voted so far, 15. Gonna wait for a few more. So this isn't a bad spread at the moment. So, okay, I think what we can safely say there is over 2/3 of you have used one or several complex compound sentences. And as I said, they're not wrong, but I'd advise you to use them really sparsely when you're summarizing scientific content for a non-expert audience, or a non-specialist audience, I should say, for someone who's not a specialist in the same field as you, because they are hard to follow and you don't want to give your reader any reason to switch off from what you're trying to tell them. So, to summarize what I just said on length and structure, choose your sentence structure intentionally and use those complex compound sentences very sparingly. Remember that full stops are your friends, so particularly when you're trying to explain something complicated, don't be afraid to make it into shorter, simpler sentences. It's really hard to sometimes think about sentence length and structure as you write, so make sure you protect time to read your work back and edit it afterwards, because you can, as we've just shown with that example, you can take some of your longer sentences and break them down later. And just to encourage you to really try and avoid multiple ideas in the same sentence. It's just too easy for a reader to get lost. So my third hack is about avoiding repetition, which you probably think you don't need to tell us this, Freya, but it happens all the time, and it happens within our team. It happens everywhere. This is how our brains like to work and think. But when you're writing for a policymaker, they are in a rush, they haven't got much time, and they are not a specialist in this subject. So you need to make this as concise as you can. So these are the places you might find that you've written repetition into your work. So within a sentence, I often spot when we've gone to describe something and we've used two adjectives or adverbs, and we could have just used one. So the example I've got on the right there is that agricultural yields will likely fall as a result of the dry and arid conditions predicted. So in that sentence, if you were writing for a policymaker, probably just one of those words will do. If the two adverbs or adjectives convey a different meaning, then it's fine to have them both, but often we can probably just pick one of the two. You might also find repetition in your writing if you look at kind of from one sentence to the next. So something that commonly happens when you're trying to communicate a complicated idea is you find a way of saying it and you put that into your first sentence, and then you sort of go and say it again in the next sentence. So the example on the right is that low likelihood outcomes such as ice sheet collapse and ocean circulation changes are within the realms of possibility. These risks must not be ruled out. So that second sentence within there is just a complete repetition of saying that something is within the realm of possibility. So pick which one of those is the most concise and the most direct, and just say it once. You're going to save words, which means your reader saves time. And then another place you might spot repetition in your writing is where we repeat the subject across sentences and across paragraphs. So on the right, this time I've done an example of where it's done well. So it says the integrated assessment model predicts changes to global monsoons will be costly. It also suggests that sea levels ... And what we've done there is we've just used the pronoun it rather than spelling out in full all the time the integrated assessment model. And that just makes it quicker to read and easier to get into your brain, really, the concept that you're trying to get across. My fourth hack, I'm whizzing through them. Simplify or sacrifice your readers. And I really do think it is quite a clear-cut one. So your end goal here is to write something that someone reads and takes that information and does something with it. So your ultimate goal is just to make them stay with you and give them no reasons to leave the page that you've written for them on. So ask yourself always, why would I use complicated language if a simpler alternative is available? And I know that if you're writing in scientific literature or writing for your peers, you might just routinely slip into using quite technical language or formal writing, but remember to keep your audience at the forefront of your mind and go with whatever's simplest. So there's a couple of ways you might end up alienating your reader. So if you use words they don't understand, that might switch them off. If you use words which are unclear, so their meaning is not clear, that could cause your reader to disengage. And if you use more words than is really necessary, because you're wasting their time and you need to kind of show them that you respect their time is precious. So these are the places that I always try and spot and avoid in my own writing. And maybe you'll see some examples in your own writing or in your peers' writing. So try to avoid using scientific or technical terms. So for example, I see anthropogenic a lot. If you're writing for a policymaker, perhaps just go for man-made. And it's not that they're not intelligent, it's just that your goal is to make it as easy for them as possible to take this information in. Don't make them work hard to understand it. Give it to them as easily as possible and directly as possible. Similarly, we talk about sequestering carbon in the scientific community. Using the word store is absolutely fine. Another place that we can be guilty of not being particularly simple is we often choose to use big words because they sound nice and they probably make us feel a bit clever, but we don't need to. And if simplicity is what you're aiming for, then swap them out. So instead of prohibitively costly, go for too expensive. And then the other thing I always look for is sometimes we write with needlessly long sentences. So we might come across a sentence like, we reached the conclusion that, and instead we could have just said, we concluded. Or we could say, we might read, we hope MPs will take action on the issue, when we could have just said, we hope MPs will act on the issue. So, you know, as you're going through your writing, try and avoid those drawn out sentences and just go for something more direct. And the fifth hack. Okay, so this one is possibly the one that it took me the longest to get my head around when I was writing, but it's the one I think fundamentally makes your writing better. And that is to use the active voice. And the active voice is a way of writing that makes a sentence personal to someone or to something. And the reasons you might want to use the active voice are that it saves you words. So again, that's about respecting the reader's time, that it's more direct, and that it clearly states who or what did the action. And this is my little formula for how I remember to write in the active voice. So in the active voice, your sentence would begin with a subject. The subject would be doing a verb, and then after the verb, you've got the rest of the details of your sentence. So as a default, I didn't used to write in the active voice. I used to write in the passive voice, and the passive voice looks a lot like the example on the top right there. So there were forest fires in several cities this summer in which thousands of homes were burned. But if I apply that formula to the sentence, I can make it active, and instead it would read like, forest fires burned thousands of homes across multiple cities this summer. And so we've just been more direct. Who is the doer? What are they doing? And what are the details? And it's hard to start thinking like that, to use the active voice straight away, but you can come back and edit it in later on. So given that I found it hard to first of all start spotting these passive and active sentences, I want you to try it out too. One of these sentences is written in the passive voice, and I want you to use Slido to vote on which one you think that is. So yes, it's the same poll number. Okay, well, clearly you all are slightly better at English than I am, because I found this such a challenge at the start. But yes, that's correct. And if we wanted to make that sentence, take it from the passive to the active voice, it would look like this. It would instead become, scientists describe the record low summer sea ice as unprecedented. So those were the 5 hacks, and there are certainly more hacks than this, but these are the ones that kind of came to mind first when I thought, what would I want to communicate to someone? And I'm going to give you I'm actually going to give you 2 minutes. I want you to look at your sentences now and think if you can apply the hacks to anything of the most recent version of your summaries that you've written. So take 2 minutes now, and then I'm going to bring you back and we're going to close off this session. So please go now and apply those hacks to your summary sentences. Okay, 30 more seconds. Okay, so I hope you've had a good opportunity to really go through and think about some of those hacks. Now, for some people, they will already be things that you know and you use, but I think it's always helpful to have a refresher. And the main thing to think about here is your audience, in this case, your policymakers, it's not that they're not clever, but it's that they're in a rush and they're busy, and we need to give them every reason to stay with our work. So of course they could sit and understand something scientific if they wanted to, but given the constraints that they're working with, you just want to make it as easy for them as possible to take your message on board. So the ways you can do that are through clear communication. Make sure you understand yourself what the main point of your research is and why someone should care, and then tell your reader it as succinctly and clearly as possible. And just remember to protect time and energy to edit your work, because these things aren't always intuitive for us. And one final comment, which is that if you are writing a policy brief, there will be certain structures that are preferred in different countries and different organizations. So I just advise you, if you're starting out writing policy briefs for the first time, seek out information, often from universities or you know, online outlets. There will be information there about how best to structure the policy brief, the report as a whole. But what I've focused on today is focusing on the language and the skills there.